Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eric Marshall. I'm the Executive Director of PDG, and I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today for the second session in our webinar series rolling out our PDG Blueprint Functional Design chapters. Today's session is being held on an ordinary Zoom line to facilitate Q&A at the end of the session, so just a few quick housekeeping notes up front. First, please do stay on mute and off of video during the presentation portion of the session. We will welcome you coming off of mute and even coming on to video during the Q&A session, but during the presentation session, please do keep your lines muted. Please do note that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations here. Please do consider questions that you have and begin to put those in the chat. You can put those into the chat either as we go through the material or at the conclusion when we have finished up the formal presentations. Also encourage you to use the speaker view in your format layout just to be able to see the speakers most clearly as we go through the session. Finally, please do note that today's session is being recorded and will be posted online without the Q&A portion, along with the slides. So you will have access to the slides, and a recording of this, again, will be posted on the PDG website and made available to participants. Next slide, please. This is the second episode in a series of webinars that PDG is holding to roll out the functional design chapters of its blueprint. Hopefully, many of you were able to join us last week for our introductory webinar, episode 1. We were joined by our interoperability committee co-chairs and Connie Jung from FDA and had a good conversation just introducing PDG and the blueprint. You can see the following sessions then dig deeper into the individual topic areas within that blueprint, and we're excited to dig into the TI and TS conversation here today. Please do note that you do have to register for each of these sessions separately. So if any of you are not registered for the future sessions shown on the screen here and would like to do so, please visit the PDG website with the link at the top to register for those additional sessions. Next slide, please. I am joined by a few great speakers today and really looking forward to the conversation. Arti Nagaraj, Manager of Analytics and Serialization at Sanofi, and David Brown, Manager of DSCSA Compliance and Pharmacy Automation with Walgreens, both serve as co-leads for our TI Exchange work group within PDG, and we're excited to have them join us and bring an industry perspective. Also joined by Bob Celeste, founder of the Center for Supply Chain Studies. Bob helped facilitate the technical work group to conversations that really drove the development of these additional chapters of the PDG blueprint, and will help provide some more of the technical insights into what is in the blueprint as we discuss it here today. Again, hopefully most of you were able to join us last week, but just a quick reminder for anyone who is not familiar, PDG is a collaborative forum and an FDA public-private partnership dedicated to developing, advancing, and sustaining effective and efficient models for interoperability under the DSCSA. Really taking those new requirements that are set to come online in November 27th of this year and casting a common vision for how we can effectively and efficiently as an industry achieve interoperability. Next slide. Ultimately, the power of the organization is in our membership. It is a large and diverse membership, as you can see reflected here on this slide, representing manufacturers, wholesalers, repackagers, logistics providers, pharmacies, as well as the various solution providers and technical experts who work in this space, all coming together again to create that shared vision for interoperability and document how the various component parts of DSCSA interoperability fit together in one comprehensive blueprint. Next slide. That blueprint really is the culmination of all of that work. And so really encourage you, if you've not done so, to visit our website on the PDG blueprint page at the address you can see there. This includes all of these additional chapters that we'll be talking through in this webinar series. It also includes a number of fact sheets, short one-page synopsis of the various chapters and some key concepts. We certainly recognize there's a lot of technical information in those chapters, and these fact sheets provide a distilled down explanation and key takeaways for you to consider. So encourage you to take a look at those materials up on that website. That link also includes the information and form to submit a change request. The material that is presented in the blueprint is intended to be open to industry conversation and feedback, and we have a defined change request process where anyone, PDG member or non-PDG member, can propose a change, revision, or addition to the blueprint, and we have a process to run those through our interoperability committee for decision. As I mentioned, the blueprint is a long, technical, very detailed document, and Bob will give you some snapshot insights of just how technical that can get here today. But as much as anything, I hope folks recognize the process that went into this document. When you get lost in the weeds, if you're seeing themes and concepts in that technical documentation that just aren't making sense to you, I hope you think back to the process and put confidence in the process that developed that document. This is a document that was developed by 60 of the best minds in the industry, working through nearly 300 work group sessions, tens of thousands of hours to develop these consensus documents. Those documents then went through a consensus development process through our interoperability committee and ultimately out to our general membership for a supermajority vote to ensure sector neutrality and balance as we put that documentation together. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we'll be focusing today on Chapter 3, but that is one piece of this blueprint framework. So Chapter 1 of our blueprint really sets out the compliance and business requirements, kind of the what requirements, as we affectionately call them in Chapter 1. Chapter 2, we discussed on last week's webinar, and that's available by recording for anyone who wasn't able to watch it, but really cast the overarching vision for interoperability and the functional requirements that come in the following chapters, kind of the how you achieve interoperability. Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 then set out the individual functional design requirements and recommendations around those core components that we think about for interoperability. TI exchange, verification, tracing, and then the use of a credentialing process in that verification and tracing activity. As I mentioned, today we'll really be focused here on that third chapter, which really is about the interoperable exchange of TI and TS. So just to provide a little bit more context for folks who aren't as close to the DSCSA, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act requires every time there is a transaction of a product, so a product covered by the statute, and a change of ownership, that the selling party provide TI, transaction information, and TS, a transaction statement, to the purchaser of that product. And the purchaser of that product then must capture and maintain that information, both parties holding it and maintaining it, storing it for 6 years. That is activity that is generally happening today, but at the lot level. So today, whenever there is a transaction of the product, 3 pieces of information are exchanged: a TI, a transaction history, or TH, and the TS. But come November 27th of this year, there are 3 big changes that are set to take place. First, that TH sunsets. We move from TI, TH, transaction history, and TS to only providing TI and TS. It will not have that composite set of TI in a single document as TH. Second, Section 582 G1A, which sets out those 2023 new enhanced requirements, requires that this exchange of TI be done in a secure, electronic, interoperable method through secure, electronic, interoperable systems and processes. So that secure electronic interoperability component is a new requirement for 2023. And finally, TI in 2023 must include the product identifier at the package level. So this is the requirement set out in 582 G1B. Today, that TI is essentially 11 different data points or elements, things like the name and address of the selling entity and the buying entity, the name of the drug, the strength and dosage, the number of containers, et cetera. Ultimately, that package level product identifier will be added in November 2023, this coming fall, which will expand that to 13 elements by adding the individual serial number and expiration date to that transaction information. If we can jump back up to slide 9. The blueprint then really focuses on identifying those preferred standards, including EPCIS, and defines those systems and processes that are needed to support accurate and reliable TI data. Next slide. A few key terms here, just for folks who may not be as familiar, to just note that will be used kind of throughout this conversation. TI, or transaction information, as I mentioned, that set of 13 individual data elements in November of 2023 that must accompany each sale of a product. Second, interoperable TI exchange. This is the requirement I was referencing in 582 G1A that requires that exchange to occur in a secure, electronic, interoperable manner. Core interoperability data we'll talk about in just a second. Misalignment exceptions are those instances where your transaction information, sometimes we call it our virtual supply chain of your data flow, becomes out of sync or does not accurately and completely match the physical product that it is intended to represent. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation as well. And then finally, EPCIS, another notion that you'll hear talked about extensively here today. This is the GS1 standard for event-based sharing of information in product movement. So I want to jump in then to kind of our first topic and start to pull our colleagues and panelists into the conversation here. So the first notion that is kind of spelled out and teed up in the blueprint that's important to understand is this notion of core interoperability data versus contextual data. As I mentioned, TI is really a set of 13 different data elements. Certain of those data elements are critical to achieving interoperability, and therefore their standardization is critical and required. You can see those really 8 elements on the left there. Versus contextual data, these are additional data elements that can be referenced to or back to some of those core interoperability data elements. They are statutorily required data elements as part of the TI, but they are not critical to achieving interoperability, or I should say their standardization is not critical to achieving interoperability. I will note you see 13 here plus a bullet point for the GLN. The 13 numbered items there represent those 13 statutory components of TI. Ultimately, as you think about the functional design, there's a notion of a GLN, a global location number, that is used to achieve interoperability and can be used as a reference point for the business name and business address. But this sets up kind of, again, that dichotomy between those elements that must be standardized to achieve interoperability versus those elements that are more contextual in nature. Those elements on the left, with one more click, really focus on being exchanged by EPCIS or web portal. And those other elements to the right, those contextual elements, are often referred to as master data elements that may be referenced in a different manner. So I want to kind of start with Bob and bring you into the conversation here, just to talk a little bit, particularly about some of those identifiers, right? You can see the link from the left with the arrows of the NDC and GTIN, providing that link to some of those contextual elements, and the GLN on the left, providing that link to business name and address. But Bob, welcome you just sharing a little bit more of the thinking, your own and the work group, around the importance of those identifiers in achieving interoperability.
Sure. So while the DSCSA calls for those 13 elements, the industry is using GS1 standards and GS1 identifiers for products and locations and also organizations. And so that's why you see the addition here of GTIN for identifying products, and then the ability to look up in your master data those elements that we are considering contextual to that. And likewise for organizations, as product moves from one organization to another, the global location number that can be used to look up the business name and business address. As you probably know, if you try to use those contextual elements as lookup fields, you'll have an issue, because as an example, I may use the avenue as part of my business address. You may have me as AVE period. Difficult to look up those things, difficult to make connections between different data sets. And so we use the identifiers, and particularly the GS1 identifier of global location number. And that's why it has an asterisk as mandatory here, but not necessarily, it's not really part of DSCSA language, but we need it in order to be able to compare locations and organizations.
Thanks, Bob. RT, I want to bring you in next. Obviously, as a manufacturer, you're kind of at the top of this chain and kicking this off, right? Talk a little bit more about kind of your experience and the importance of those interoperability data elements and getting things kicked off at the manufacturer end in a way that sets up for success.
Thanks, Eric. So the core interoperability data elements, as they are listed on the screen, these, like the name suggests, like it's essential to have these elements standardized among trading partners. And the blueprint chapter 1 actually talks about all of the formats. Like it says, okay, the NDC has to be a 10-digit NDC, including hyphens. It gives the format of the expiry date, etc. As a manufacturer, like these elements are really important to have a standard on, because it not only gives you a common understanding of the data between trading partners, but it also allows the data to be consumed without errors between trading partner systems. Standardization of the core interoperability data elements are especially important because the TI forms the basis in many cases for verification and tracing. So this common understanding of this data is important.
David, I'll come to you next here. We talk about those contextual data elements and that this notion that having them standardized is not necessarily critical to interoperability because they're referenced from some of those other data points. But at the same time, right, I know you are kind of at the end catching all of that as it comes downstream and getting it from multiple sources. Talk a little bit more about just kind of that challenge and how you think about that contextual data point.
Definitely, yeah. I think the PDG blueprint does call out standardization of those core elements, and that the contextual element, that standardization is not critical for that interoperability. But those standardization of those contextual data elements can assist with like determining if there's any sort of data discrepancies. So as previously stated, the drug name, the strength, the dosage form is kind of established when you're exchanging that initial master data to assign that to a specific NDC. But when it is required to be part of that TI, standardization of those data elements can assist with looking to see, hey, is there actually a discrepancy between the drug name or the dosage form, and having kind of a standardized format or presentation would be helpful for dispensers. So I think within chapter 1 of the blueprint, there are call outs to that target formats, which are considered to be part of the contextual, but are considered to be directional points that trading partners can consider or reference to assist with standardization, but again, is called out to not be critical for interoperability.
Thanks, David. If you can jump to the next slide, I want to move on to obviously an important notion that hopefully most folks are familiar with at least at a certain level, which is this notion of EPCIS as an event-based mechanism to support this exchange of TI. Through our blueprint process, PDG recognized EPCIS as that primary or preferred method of TI exchange. However, we do recognize that it may not be and will not be the exclusive method. So next slide, we'll share just a little bit of kind of how we think about that in terms of the different options. Ultimately, we really kind of put the methods of TI exchange, how you actually go about exchanging those 13 elements from the prior slide between trading partners. First is EPCIS, using that GS1 standard event-based mechanism for exchanging TI and TS, and we'll get into much more detail on what that looks like. Second is the notion of portal access, just recognizing that there are going to be trading partners who just aren't in a position to establish the kind of connection and capabilities to ingest and manage EPCIS data, but may instead access their information through a portal provided by their upstream trading partner who they're purchasing from, or a solution provider. And then third is ultimately a recognition that the statute identifies and authorizes the use of alternate methods of compliance. And so while those first two really are core to interoperability, ultimately the statute recognizes there are going to be other use cases in other alternate methods that may be needed in certain contexts. And so by special arrangement, trading partners may use other approaches, right? There may be the occasional need to send a PDF or a flat file or use some other method of providing TI. ultimately, if you click ahead one click, you'll see our focus within PDG has really been on defining that interoperable network that incorporates EPCIS as that preferred mechanism and portal access as that secondary option. That is not to suggest that alternate methods are non-compliant. As we mentioned, the statute calls that out. But as we think about defining those interoperable systems and processes, it's really those two pieces that we talked about there. So David, I may come to you first here. The portal issue, right, especially comes up right in that dispenser context, and a lot of dispensers who aren't going to be able to establish that EPCIS connection. I know for you at Walgreens in particular, right, that may not be the case just given the volumes and level at which you're working, but that portal still has a lot of applicability, especially in that dispenser sector. Tell us how you're kind of thinking about those two options.
Sure. Yeah, definitely, Eric. So yeah, exchanging GS1 EPCIS messages is called out as being preferred, and I think can be beneficial for dispensers who may have like a large number of suppliers or who want to consolidate their TI into like a single repository. But portal access may be also like sufficient for dispensers who are not capable of receiving that EPCIS data, where they can just log into a web portal to confirm that receipt and retrieve that enhanced TI. So I think PDG has call outs to like the standards also just around that human readable presentation, which will also be important for dispensers to ensure they have that TI data available. But both methods could be accessible just depending on the model of the business.
Thanks. In RT, I know both really, right, become critical at your level, EPCIS being a core given volumes, but also recognizing different arrangements like working directly with dispensers where that portal access becomes important. Talk a little bit about it from your perspective.
Yeah, so our preference obviously is having the direct connection with EPCIS, but we do recognize that, you know, in many cases, dispensers may not have the bandwidth to have the one-on-one EPCIS connection. So we do have the opportunity to provide portal access. In terms of verification and tracing, again, EPCIS is preferred because it just makes it more seamless and standardized to have verification and tracing when it is with EPCIS. But portals can also support that with some challenges.
Thanks, RT. Let's go ahead and jump ahead one slide. So this is where things start to get a little bit more technical. And so first thing I'm always going to do there is pull Bob in. So Bob, talk a little bit more about how the blueprint just kind of helps guide people through that application of EPCIS. Obviously, you know, GS1's done a lot of work there. They have implementation guidelines, and we didn't set out to counter that or try to recreate that, but provide people with a little bit of a guide of how to think about starting to apply those. Share a little bit more just kind of about how we've tried to hit that balance in the blueprint.
Sure. So EPCIS is a rich standard for tracking the events that take place that affect either products or services. And so it's, as I said, it's a rich standard. You could use it for a lot of different things. What we did was we tried to map the DSCSA 13 elements and determine the events that within EPCIS that would be needed. And I think if you move forward just a moment, so you'll see in a slide in a few moments how these map. Oops, come back one. So TI data is spread across 3 different events that are core to what we're trying to do here in transmitting them using EPCIS. First is the commissioning event, which is when a product or even a case or a tote is created. It's given its identifier. It now can be identified at a certain date and time. And then as you pack those events, as you pack those cases with packages, that packaging hierarchy is helpful and needed by trading partners. And then lastly, obviously, shipping event, which is the event that actually moves the product from one owner to another. And so using those 3 events, we're able to apply TITS data and also move that through the supply chain. So those are the three events that we're using within EPCIS. EPCIS, again, is very rich, and there's other events, as you see here, that can be used by trading partners for their own benefits internally. But you'll see over and over again within our documentation, commissioning, packing, and shipping events. I think we could go to the next one. So this is, if you could go back up one. There you go. A little bit of an eye chart, I think, from everybody, but a couple of takeaways from here. And this depicts two trading partners, a seller and a buyer. Seller could be a manufacturer, it could be a wholesaler. Buyer could be a wholesaler or a dispenser. And so two takeaways from this. One is the arrows that go from left to right is the EPCIS events that hold the TI/TS data and transmit that to the buyer. And as we'll talk later, if there are issues with that data, then there'll be a replacement EPCIS events to make the buyer whole. The other key takeaway here is if you look at the gray boxes around on the outside of what we're focused on here, which is TI/TS exchange, you'll notice that TI/TS exchange and the information that is gathered and created and shared are core to the other transactions, PI verification and TI tracing. And so that data you'll see used over again in those different areas and where it's sourced from. If we go to the next slide. A lot of these diagrams that we'll be reviewing today are illustrative. And so they may talk about internal processing. That's really not part of the interoperability standard that we're pulling together here, but they give you an idea of the kinds of checks that you may want to do and the data that's available to you. So again, the 13 elements for TI are shown in the two ways that we have realized for moving TI and TS data, EPCIS in the above diagram, and again, seeing that those 13 elements spread across the three different EPCIS events of commissioning, aggregation, which is packing, and shipping events. And then if we're talking about a portal, those data elements may be presented in many different ways, depending on the portal owner. But they do have to be presented, and they do need to be shared with trading partners in order to make them whole from a DSCSA point of view. And so this is just to show the two different ways that data could be transmitted or shared, and that it is the same data and how it maps. So a couple more eye charts, and this one is to just talk a little bit about moving TI/TS data, and this would be an EPCIS move from a supplier to a purchaser, and the kind of checks that may be made throughout in their process. So if you're a purchaser, oops, sorry, go back up just one. If you're a purchaser, you will get EPCIS data or TI data most likely before the shipment shows up. And so there's certain checks that you can make at that point in time. You can check against your orders. You also can do some data checks for correct data in the TI/TS data and start the process of error correction should there be an issue. If not, then at the reconciliation point, and reconciliation can take place at many points within your processing. And it depends on your own internal SOPs. You may be scanning product as it arrives, or you may be scanning in a case most likely of a wholesaler where a product is scanned on outbound as it's picked for orders. At that point, you have the opportunity, you've scanned an item physically, and you have the opportunity to then check that against the EPCIS data or the TI data that you've either received through EPCIS or have available to you through a portal, and make the check then, and then determine whether if you do have TI data, then that product can move forward. If not, then there will be a exception processing based on your own SOPs. Next slide. So this is a more detailed look at receiving product through scanning. And as I note there, this scanning process may take place in different steps within your own process. However, this just gives you an idea of the kinds of checks that could be made and when they could be made, and what you may be doing with that information and the communications that may be needed with your trading partner based on the scans that you have on the data, and also the EPCIS. Again, checks against your orders, checks against between the product and the EPCIS or TI data that you either have received or have access to, and then the kinds of processes that may take place based on the results of those checks, whether it turns into a just a normal good scan and you move forward and you consider that product reconciled, or it may be an error exception process, or even it could be, depending on the appearance of the product and some other factors that you have in your SOPs, a suspect product investigation could be kicked off from that point. Go to the next one.
Thanks, Bob. And I'll just kind of quickly introduce the next few slides. So what Bob just walked through, right, is kind of your standard within a commercial relationship, established relationship. Often, not necessarily always, but often kind of right, one of those transactions within a typical manufacturer to wholesaler to dispenser supply chain and exchange. There are a number of different kind of alternate commercial arrangements, right? And it's funny when you start talking about them, how many of them start to come out of the woodwork. But where the product doesn't follow that, kind of, again, traditional manufacturer, wholesaler, dispenser kind of pathway. And when that possession of the product starts to diverge from what DSCSA requires to be traced of ownership. And so there are a number of those arrangements that the blueprint kind of provides some frameworks and mapping of this type around. And so for each of those here, Bob, I'll welcome you just kind of providing a little bit more of that technical explanation of what people will find in those pictures that you draw so well. And then, RT and David talking just a little bit about kind of the practical application of that on your side.
Yeah, so the team went through, again, these are illustrative, and the team went through a number of situations or that could take place within the trading partner relationship, and worked out whether we have enough information, we have the correct information, is it available at the right time, can the processes move forward. And so these next few slides are really talking about some particular situations and how that information would be used and processed in those areas. In this particular one, we have two trading partners, and we're looking at a drop shipment. So this is the interaction from a TITS data point of view between the shipper, the one that's drop shipping, and a wholesaler's customer, which would most likely be a dispenser. And so we've determined three different ways, and I know it's an eye chart, but those three lines that are running through the middle of the diagram are those three different ways. And one is that if the wholesaler has made an agreement that they would pass through TITS data, then the manufacturer would pass that data to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler would pass it to their customer, the dispenser. A second way is that the manufacturer might provide information to their portal on shipping documents that the dispenser could then access that information through the manufacturer's portal. The third way is that if the manufacturer and the dispenser do have a trading relationship, they may have other products that they trade directly, and so they have an EPCIS connection. In those cases, they may also have an agreement that the manufacturer would provide that TITS data directly to the dispenser. So this is just to illustrate the many different ways that TITS could be provided to the dispenser as that product arrives.
Thanks, Bob. RT, David, thoughts on just kind of how you manage this from your side? Go ahead, RT.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Our first preference would be, for distributors who do provide that opportunity to do a pass-through of the unedited TI. That would be obviously our first preference. The second would be, okay, if we do have a direct connection with the dispenser, we would leverage that. And finally, we would, put it on the portal. I think the challenge here as a manufacturer is, since there are so many different options, it's trying to identify, okay, with a certain trading partner, how do you address a drop ship? I think that's the challenge. The way we are looking at it is like doing this through the onboarding process, trying to figure out, how do we do a pass through? Do we put it on the portal, or is it a direct connection? So it varies by the trading partner.
Thanks, RT. David, talk about drop ships on the receiving end there.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I guess I would say that for instances where a dispenser has that existing relationship with the manufacturer, the route probably preferred would be to receive that TI and TS through that existing connection. But if that direct relationship, that manufacturer does not exist, it may be beneficial for those dispensers to receive that TI and TS through the wholesaler or through the web portal. And I think it's to avoid the need to set up new data connections with indirect trading partners. In some cases, there's dispensers that need to set up a lot of new types of connections with direct trading partners. And I think going into indirect trading partners complicates it and would further increase the risk of meeting that November deadline. And so I think that a lot of dispensers are going to rely potentially on receiving that data through a wholesaler or going through a web portal if they don't have that connection.
Thanks, David. Bob, the next one we had kind of mapped up and had conversation around that, maybe not quite as common, but does happen there, this notion of consignment product.
Yeah, so the issue here is that in consignment, you ship the product. However, ownership doesn't transfer until possibly, depending on your agreement, that when the product is actually used. And so the issue here is that you want to have TITS available to the dispenser so that they actually can use the product. And so what was decided was that it would probably be best to provide that TITS data at the time of shipment. So in normal situations, other than consignment, that would trigger the actual ownership change, but in consignment, it's not the ownership change, but we want to be able to provide that information to the dispenser so that when they need to use the product, they can use the product. And so that's an illustration of an agreement between the consignment entity and the dispenser.
Thanks. And David, I know you at the pharmacy end, right, end up with kind of trying to manage this until you use it, as Bob says there. Talk a little bit about that pharmacy perspective.
Sure, yeah. I think for pharmacies that do participate in a consignment model, there are concerns that having that TI and TS at receiving. And so yeah, what the blueprint and what the PDG is aligned on is that when that product is shipped, then that supplier provides that TI and TS so that dispenser can perform that reconciliation and confirmation that that TI and TS has been received, versus the alternative would be potentially dispensing that product and then receiving TI and TS to represent that transfer of ownership has occurred, and then potentially finding out a data discrepancy after the fact. And so I think the PDG blueprint calls out that receiving it upfront is important, just to find those discrepancies and ensure that you have the proper documentation.
Yeah, and I probably should start all of that right with highlighting that statutory component here, right, which is that the purchaser received the TI at or before that change of ownership, right, which is what creates that challenge if you don't know when change of ownership is going to occur in this kind of context, and it's going to occur immediately before use. How do you manage that at or before kind of component? Next, just a couple more of these replacement orders. One that came up here as well. Bob, go ahead. Hit that first.
Sure. So in a case where there's an issue with a product that needs to be replaced, even though that product may have been moved from a manufacturer to a wholesaler to a dispenser, the dispenser may be making a product quality complaint or a replacement order with the manufacturer. The manufacturer then would ship that product out, but they also need to make that dispenser whole with TI data for the new product. And so that actually is taking place directly between the manufacturer and the dispenser in this illustration. And the manufacturer is then either providing TITS data through EPCIS if they have that kind of connection, or they're making that TITS data available to the dispenser through the manufacturer's portal. So that's that kind of working out, how do we make the end point in the supply chain whole from a TITS point of view in this kind of arrangement.
RT, is that something you all run into?
Yeah, we do have a lot of replacement orders. And again, here, like it could be that the dispenser is an indirect customer. We may not have a direct relationship with the dispenser. And in this case, it might very well mean that we put that TITS out on a portal. With replacements, there are other things to think about, like how do you have the original, how do you tie that replacement to an original PO, etc. But the biggest piece is like ironing out with the dispenser, stating that the TITS will be on the portal if we don't have a direct relationship.
Good. Last one. This is far from an edge case, right? When you start talking about volumes in one of the most complicated, but 340B arrangements. Go ahead, Bob.
Sure. So this is a situation where the relationship between a wholesaler, a covered entity, and a contracted dispenser, the TITS data goes to the new owner that the wholesaler is aware of, and that would be the covered entity. However, the product itself is being shipped to the contracted dispenser. And so one of the areas that this is more a recommendation, is that it's more prevalent that the wholesaler is contracted to send the TITS to both of those entities. And so that provides information so that the contracted dispenser also has TITS data for their records as they actually would use the product. They're also both known to the wholesaler who has performed that due diligence on both of those entities. And so this is an illustration of how that could take place, and that TITS data needs to be shared with both the covered entity and the contracted dispenser.
And I'm sure this is one, RT, David, you both run into. RT, go ahead and go first.
Yeah, I think here how should I put this? I think something to consider is system limitations in sending TI to both parties. It may mean, assuming there are written agreements in place and you do decide to send TI to both parties, it could very well mean sending a PDF or a flat file to one, and the other one you send it directly via EPCIS. So again, some of the things or questions to keep in mind while onboarding your customers.
Thanks, RT. David, anything you want to add there? Okay.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll add that, as part of 2015 compliance with the exchange of the TI, TH, and TS, there might already be those agreements in place between the wholesaler and that covered entity, so that the contracted pharmacy or dispenser can receive that TI. So I think that it would just be about having those conversations with the supplier and then with the covered entity, just to ensure that the contracted dispenser still has access to that TI, and that there are plans to exchange it with that contracted dispenser.
Thanks, David. So again, hopefully that gives you a sense. I know there's a lot more detail than we can cover in the time that we have here, but a sense of the kind of practical application diagrams that you can find in the blueprint and some of the resources that you'll find. A lot of pictures that help you kind of walk through and apply that existing work that is out there from organizations like GS1 and some of those more atypical arrangements that present those challenges. So Bob, RT, David, thanks for walking through those. There's one last concept that's important and teed up in the blueprint, and I'll turn to that in just a second here. But first, I'll just remind folks, we will, once we get through this concept, open it up for questions that anyone has. And so be thinking about questions you have, and feel free to start throwing those into the chat. I see one in there already, but feel free to start considering and putting those into the chat. So the last concept that you'll find in that blueprint, key concept in the blueprint around TI exchange, is this notion of misalignment exceptions and how to process those. A misalignment exception, as we define it, right, is that notion where your TI, your virtual data representing the supply chain, and your physical product that is supposed to be represented by that TI are out of sync. It may be that you had an overage, and so the TI reflects 14 units and you actually got 16 units, or most of the data looks right, but the serial number is incorrect come 2023, et cetera, where you get that misalignment of the data from the physical product. And a big part of what we kind of walk through is our framework for how to handle those exceptions within the blueprint. And we really use a 3-part framework that's laid out in there. Is identify, understand, and resolve framework. Identify, meaning what are your systems and processes in your organization? And these are going to be business specific, to actually identify that misalignment exists, to recognize that your data in your physical are out of sync. Second, once you've identified that, what is your process? I think we started to call it an inquiry process to understand what happened. Really the key decision there being, do you feel that they're out of sync because it was a data error? Everything is good with the product. We were supposed to have this product, but something is just wrong with the data. Or is there a reason to believe this may be suspect product and you need to head down that suspect product pathway? How do you make that decision? What's your inquiry process? And how do you collaborate with your trading partners, being a key there to reach that conclusion? And then third, once you've reached that conclusion, obviously if your conclusion is that you're going to treat it as a suspect product, that heads you down a very specific regulatory pathway. But if your conclusion is that it is good, valid product, but there's just quote unquote, just something wrong with the data, right? How are you going to resolve that? Are you going to send the product back? Are you going to get supplemental TI to reflect that product? Is there a different way you're going to go about correcting that product? How will you handle that? And will you do that in a timely way that minimizes the impact on product availability and patient access? And so that's really the framework that we kind of use and lay out in the blueprint. In PDG recently just hosted with HDA and GS1 a workshop really to dig into these much more deeply. And we'll soon be publishing a report from that workshop outlining some conclusions and key points. But a couple of things there. One, Bob, maybe in 30 seconds or less, we kind of extended this down to the dispenser level. Welcome your comments there. And then RT, David, just talk about kind of what you're planning for and the challenges you see coming in that exception space.
Sure. So we took the product of HDA, which focuses on manufacturer to wholesaler, those high volume transactions, and we try to apply that to the other parts of the supply chain, dispensers, even wholesaler to wholesaler, and sort of generalize that. So we looked at it from a supplier purchaser point of view, and looked at all the different kinds of exceptions, went through the same process of where one might be identifying it, that there may be an issue, understanding the issue, being able to differentiate from different other issues that same data could be pointing to, and then how the two trading partners would go about resolving and making each other whole from a TITS point of view.
Thanks, Bob. RT, you want to comment on the exception process first?
Sure. From our side, Eric, we are kind of bringing together a cross team within the company, because exceptions could, go across teams. It could be with the DC, quality, customer service, ITS, etc. So that's how we are tackling it, coming together and then building a process to say, okay, if we see this happen, how do we go about the processing to understand what the exception is, and then what our next steps to resolve it could be. Resolution, again, it can be complex, it can be time consuming, depending on the issues that are found. And again, in many cases, like you mentioned, it will involve trading partner communication before we jump in to resolve it. And chapter 3 of the blueprint outlines some of these steps to resolve these exceptions.
Thanks, RT. David, anything you want to add on that exceptions front?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that for dispensers, they may need to develop new policies and procedures around this, or enhance the existing ones that they have. And in terms of identify, a dispenser would need to know what misalignments to look for and how they're going to look for those misalignments. And for understanding, they may need to know what stakeholders need to be involved. Are they internal stakeholders such as IT, or external stakeholders such as your solution provider or the supplier that provided the data? And then in order to resolve, they'll need a process to document, and then a set of criteria in order to make a determination of, are you expecting new data? Are you expecting to return the product? Or are you expecting to go down potentially that suspect product route?
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Artie. Thank you, Bob. All really helpful insights. I want to turn now and make sure we have a little bit of time here for questions because they're starting to pour in the chat. So last plug there before we do that, reminder, there are some additional sessions coming up. Encourage you to register for those. Again, we will get this recording and the last recording up onto the website shortly. We're just trying to figure out how to strip out get the Q&A portion stripped out before we post those, and then we will have those up